All right, well, I can tell things are getting a little sleepy. I was sitting over here and thinking about all the weed issues that we have to deal with, and the reason I don't mind talking about Russian knapweed is because we actually have some pretty good options to control Russian knapweed. So that's sort of a nice thing when you get up here to give a talk to a group like this. It's not doom and gloom. We have a lot of good options for Russian knapweed. And over the last couple of years, we've had some really good success stories getting native grass established. And so what I want to talk about is just an overview of some of the things we've learned over the last 5 or 6 years that we've worked with Russian knapweed, and give you some insights into why it behaves in the way it does, why it does so well in most of Colorado. In fact, we used to think that just the Arkansas River was the epicenter. I see Shelley smiling over here. The epicenter for Russian knapweed, but I don't think you have to feel that way anymore, that you can share that honor with lots of other parts of the state. In fact, I don't know if it was totally due to the construction of DIA, but we've seen a lot more Russian knapweed around Denver metro area, and our first real notice of it was around the construction of the DIA airport. So we have probably around there, just around the airport itself, there's probably a couple hundred acres of Russian knapweed that have become established over the last 5 or 6 years. Oh, let me also acknowledge, I didn't take a minute on that first slide to say I want to acknowledge my grad students, Cameron Douglas, who's here to give the next talk, and Joe Vasius, who just finished his PhD, but without their help, most of this work wouldn't have been possible. I'd also like to acknowledge some other supporters. The Colorado Water Conservation Board has provided some funding to do Russian knapweed work on the Arkansas. The Coalition and the Walton Family Foundation have supported some work that I'm doing over here on the Dolores River. And I'd like to now acknowledge Sparky Caber and his crew, because when you live 6 hours away, there's nothing better than to be able to call somebody on the phone and say, how do the plots look? Do I need to come over and do anything? So the guys that work for Sparky have been a big, big help. The other thing is that Russian knapweed is well adapted to lots of different areas, and in some cases you wind up with a situation where you have a lot of options. In this top case, this is actually what some of the Russian knapweed looks like around DIA. So we've got very flat ground, but and very well suited to reestablishment of native grasses. The knapweed does as well as the native grasses would. And then a few years ago, Native Ed sent me this picture from down in the Cortez area. And this is not the kind of situation I'd like to try to be dealing with, because this kind of broken topography makes it really difficult to do anything as far as reseeding. But in a situation like this, you have lots of different options. You can get in with tractors and seeders and do a lot of different things. Just a little note about some of the work that I'm doing in the area. Over in Gateway, we've got a real nice site that Sparky found for us. It's an old abandoned pasture that was planted primarily, I think it was smooth brome, which is in itself kind of a weed species for most of our work. But it's been abandoned, totally taken over by Russian knapweed, so it's been a really good research site. And then over in Ordway, which is north of Rocky Ford, we have probably one of the biggest infestations of Russian knapweed that I've ever seen. This particular landowner that I'm working with, this is mostly CRP ground, but that's 1,400 acres. It's basically just solid knapweed. So you can see that there's a lot of opportunities to do research on Russian knapweed across the state. Well, the main thing to remember about Russian knapweed ecology is that it's a little different than some of the other weed species we deal with. It's much less dependent on seed production than a lot of other plants that we deal with, than the other knapweed especially. It's primarily, you look at the production of seeds, 1,200 seeds per plant seems like a lot, but there are a number of weed species that can produce 1 million seeds from a single plant. So 1,200 weed species, or 1,200 seeds is not that much seed production. And the seed heads tend to remain closed, and so the seed dispersal is not really the major part that allows this plant to persist. And if we think about some of the research that's been done, there's a lot of evidence that says, plants really are not as dependent on seed production and seedling establishment as they are on the rhizome system. So one thing that's been very interesting is that we have these things that the ecologists might call recruitment events, where you have the one wet spring that you have in 10 years, and all of a sudden you start to see seedling knapweeds everywhere. And that's what we noticed in 2009. You know, we were kind of wondering why we don't see Russian knapweed seedlings that often. And all of a sudden in 2009, I don't know if you remember, that was a really nice spring. In fact, we even had rain along the front range into early July, which is pretty unusual. But we saw just a massive explosion of seedlings. And if you look at the literature, you can see why. The seeds need fairly long-term exposure to soil moistures that are close to field capacity in order to establish. So it's not going to be every year you're not going to see seedlings like you do with Russian thistle or kochia. It's going to take one of these special recruitment events in order for the seedlings to become established. All right. And that's not really the perenniating structure. What makes it difficult to control Russian knapweed, of course, are the buds that grow along the root system and on the crown. These adventitious buds are very similar to what you see on leafy spurge. I don't know how many of you are familiar with leafy spurge, but a good analogy would be to say that Russian knapweed is the xeric version of leafy spurge, because leafy spurge requires a lot more moisture, but Russian knapweed and leafy spurge share a lot of the same morphology. They have very extensive root systems, produce a lot of crown buds and root buds, and that's what allows the plant to persist. Now, the other thing that's interesting about Russian knapweed is that it is allelopathic, and believe me, I am not a strong believer in allelopathic, but over the years I've been convinced from what I've seen in the literature and what I've seen in the field that allelopathy is coming from the root systems is one of the other things that allows this plant to really become established and to maintain itself essentially as a monoculture. And the other knapweeds, though, we certainly at CSU have done a lot of work on the different knapweeds and the potential allelopathy, and I am totally convinced that there is no allelopathy with spotted or diffuse knapweed, but I'm a believer now in looking at the allelopathy from the root system. And for a long time there was a question, well, if you have a really large, a fairly old stand of Russian knapweed, there's a lot of twigs and duff that occurs on the soil surface. And there was some suggestion that you needed to break that up in order to get plants established, your seeded grasses. But we did some work looking at establishment in no-till versus complete seedbed preparation situations, and it didn't matter. As long as we used a herbicide that was effective to control the plant, we didn't have to do any tillage. So there's nothing really in the duff or all that material that's deposited every year that results in allelopathy. What's important is what comes out of the growing root system. And let me just show you a couple slides that convinced me. This is some work that we started around DIA, probably been about 4 years ago. And this site, what we did is we had our student hourlies go in, and on a weekly basis, they went in with scissors and clipped off all the above ground top growth. So we essentially eliminated any competition above ground. And you can see what happened in the background here where we used herbicides. I think this is actually the Tordon plot right here. We have really good establishment of western wheatgrass, and this is slender right here. If you look at the plots where we did essentially the top growth removal, look how sparse the establishment is. If you compare the biomass, you're looking at about an 80% reduction in biomass. Okay, these were hand weeded 7 times during the growing season, so there was very little competition above ground. And the same thing happened even where we did tillage. So this is an area where we prepared a really good seed bed, planted the 2 grass species, and still there's something, these allelopathic compounds that are coming from the root system, we're still able to reduce the stand of those seeded grasses. So that's one of the other reasons that makes it very difficult to control and to get established. And if you look at management options, there really aren't a lot of good management options other than herbicides. Dan, you heard Dan being on the feed right there, don't try to hide. How are we coming along on the biocontrol agent?
You're going to hear about it in about an hour and a half.
Okay, so make sure you're here for Dan's talk. He didn't pay me to set up his talk, but really, it would be nice if we had something to provide some support on the valve control side, but at this point, we're really not in a position to recommend that. But if you look at any of the other options that people might be considering for perennial weed control, things like burning and grazing and mowing and tillage, these are really not viable options for the most part. And primarily because we've got this below ground root mass that we have to deal with. And there's no really good way to deal with that other than herbicide. When we try to do tillage and we leave an untreated control, what we wind up with is that plot has more stems per unit area than where we didn't do any disturbance. So if you disturb the soil, you're going to get more stems per unit area. It's just a release of all those crown buds. All right, so what are management options? Well, I hate to sound like another commercial for Dow AgroSciences, but we do have a lot of products that Dow is responsible for. Some of these are now generic, but Tordon and Transline were sort of the cornerstones of any program that might be trying to control Russian knapweed. Along came Milestone, which does have a number of options, a number of characteristics that do make it very advantageous to use in these riparian systems, and probably the best one is that there are no groundwater advisories, and you can use Milestone right up to the water's edge. So that gives you a lot of options. You don't have to be concerned about depth of groundwater and those sort of things. So that's what makes Milestone right now sort of the herbicide of choice when controlling Russian knapweed in these riparian environments. If you're up on an upland environment or a dryland site where you really don't have to worry about it, well then Tordon or generic versions of Tordon or Transline and its generic counterparts are available and will work extremely well. One thing I will point out that I have learned about Tordon is that if you're in a really dry year or dry environment, Tordon is probably your best option. Over in Ordway, we've done work with demonstration plots looking at Milestone and Transline and some other products. And it's just so dry over there this past year. From the time of application to when we rated the plots, which was December to August, there was only an inch and a half of rain over that time period. And the only herbicide that really provided what I would call exceptional control was a quart of Tordon. So in those really dry environments, Tordon is really a better option. In the riparian environment, Milestone is probably your best choice. And then, the nice thing about these products is that we have a lot of options as far as the time of application. They provide both foliar and soil activity. Probably the worst part is that now, especially along the Front Range, we're starting to get these populations of weeds where we have Russian knapweed and whitetop, or Russian knapweed and perennial pepperweed occurring together. And unfortunately, we really don't have a product that will do both, control both species at the same time. So that is probably the big gap with most of these products, is that they're very weak on the mustards. So if you have a site where you have a combination of Russian knapweed and whitetop or perennial pepperweed, you've got to look at applying or adding an SU into the mix. The other thing is, with Milestone that we've seen over the years, and we've been working with this with seeded grasses for a long time, we've got pretty good confidence that you can spray in, say, make a spring or a fall application and dormant seed that next growing season, and if you have moisture, you'll have excellent establishment. So that's kind of the nice thing. And these are kind of the scenarios that we have explored, looking at spring versus fall, and then looking at December or April plantings for our native grasses. Moisture is always important. In this environment, you just never know what's going to happen, and so you have to be patient. But anytime you can get moisture after application, it always seems to help the control and then provides an opportunity for you to get grasses to establish. And what we see at the Ordway site, that picture that I showed at the beginning, where we, control is probably only about 65 or 70%. With the Milestone, is probably because we've had such limited amounts of moisture. And so really that affects the application. Now, what's going to be interesting is with some moisture over the winter, are we going to see this material, are we going to see better control as we get into the next year or two? Because these things do have residual soil activity. And what we've seen is about 24 months of control, even without good grass competition. So you've got an option where you've got almost 2 years of weed control, and during that 2 years, if you can get the grasses established, that's when you're really going to make some progress. And our site down at DIA, we're looking at probably, I'm thinking we're getting close to 5 years worth of weed control. 5 years at almost 100% weed control, using milestone with seeded grasses. All right. This little, let's see, this is the kind of work that we've been doing both on the West Slope and the Arkansas Valley. The two sites are very different as far as the communities. One sort of a standard riparian site that we're trying to recover. A lot of them have remnant plant species, which is also very interesting that you go into these sites without knowing what's there other than Russian knapweed. You'll control the Russian knapweed, and then you'll be very surprised about the remnants that are there and how much comes back. So this is down at Ordway, and you can see over here, this is all sand drop seed. And this is what the Russian knapweed look like right next to it. So even without doing any seeding, just controlling the Russian knapweed, if you have, you will be surprised on many occasions what's there in the understory of that Russian knapweed as a remnant species. So you can be very surprised about the response that you get at these different sites. This is another one of our big studies at DIA. This is the rosettes of Russian knapweed here, and comparing that to nearly 100% control that we got with 7 ounces of milestone. Again, this is a perfect location for restoration because it's fairly flat. We can get in there with drills and different equipment. It's a well-drained site, and so it's got a lot of opportunities to come back and do reestablishment. And you can see that this would be the spring after application. The weed controls are really, really good. And this is the kind of establishment that we were able to get at this particular site. This is western wheatgrass right here, and this is slender. You know, I've been really impressed over the last 5 or 6 years that we've been doing most of this work about how well slender wheatgrass establishes. So if you've got a site that's adapted for cool season grasses, just make sure you've got a fair amount of slender in there because it's probably the best establisher that we've seen over the years. This is what we were working with Sparky. That's actually Sparky driving the tractor there. But this is the site at Ordway that we worked on, and we seeded into this. Unfortunately, it's been very dry, and we're still hoping that this next growing season will get some pretty good establishment. But all this light tan material here, this is all just Russian knapweed residue that's left from this site, and pretty much 100% Russian knapweed. Now, this is just a little bit overview of that particular site, and I will say that there we've reduced the stand density of Russian knapweed by 100%. You have essentially 100% control. If we look at the Ordway site, what we tend to see is that it looks fairly good here, but we still have a lot of Russian knapweed that survived that initial application, and we're still hoping we'll get decent control once we get some moisture. All right, so what's the take-home message? The take-home message is pretty simple, that Russian knapweed is really not that dependent on seed production. So, we're not really needing to worry as much about seed production with Russian knapweed as we are with a lot of other species. The seeds can germinate in all kinds of conditions. So if you have soil moisture, if you've got that period of 5 to 7 days with good soil moisture, you're going to get seedling established. It's very well adapted to the other conditions that we see here on the west slope in the front range. It does well in salinity. You don't have to have much seed barrel. It does well just under a layer of duct. The most important thing is really controlling that below ground biomass. And if you can get that biomass controlled and you have good establishment, or you planted native grasses, you will get good establishment assuming you get a little bit of moisture. And really, that's the key thing. Controlling that below ground biomass is really critically important. Because if you do that and you have the moisture and you've got native remnants there, or you planted native grass, you can get pretty good establishment. And we've seen that over and over again. If we get a decent amount of moisture for establishment of the grasses, and we apply milestone, transline, tordon. I mean, we've definitely done a lot of work with the new DuPont product. We can get great establishment. So the nice thing about talking about Russian knapweed is that we've got some really good options, and we can get good native grass establishment without too much effort, assuming we get some rainfall. Okay, with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions. Yes?
You say that you could go ahead and seed native grasses in 3 or 4 months after 2 months?
Yes, you can, and we've done that. It wouldn't be my preference because I think it'd be a little safer to do a rosette application on the knapweed like in the spring and then seed. But we've done it both ways. We've done spring, fall application, dormant season seeding. So you don't want the grasses to come up until the next spring. But we seeded in December and had excellent establishment. So we sprayed in September, seeded in December, and by spring we had excellent establishment.
Being the proud steward of your irrigation area, we treated it with transline last fall. We were broadcast over that. Like now, you think we might have a chance?
Yeah, okay. I was just remembering that I was reminded to repeat the question. So the question is if I assume you're down in Cortez? Okay, so that slide I showed with all the broken ground there and all the Russian knapweed, that was from Cortez. There's no issue, I mean, and transline is even easier on the grass than milestone. It's probably the safest, so you should be, the question was, could he fly on some seed after making an application of transline a year ago?
No, last fall.
Last fall. I think you'd be fine as well. And if you get the moisture, you'll get establishment. One thing I would say is that broadcast seeding is probably the least efficient, and if there's any way you can just run a cultipacker or any kind of machine to push the seed into the ground. Yeah. ATVs pulling a little, even driving the ATV around might be enough to push the seed in the ground. But I'll tell you, at the the Gateway site, one of our best seeding operations is where we broadcast the seed, and then we just rolled over it with just a little harrow with little nipples on it that push the seed in the ground, and that looks like it's going to be the best option. So no real need to go in with a drill. If you have a broadcast seeder, and then you have some way to push the seed into the ground to get better seed to soil contact, it'll do a lot better establishment. But yeah, what can you do?
Yeah, we lost track of it.
Okay. Any other questions? I'll be around all day, so. Oh. No, we haven't, and actually we had a big published paper, I wouldn't call it big, but we did publish a paper, a 10-state protocol where we had spring versus fall applications of milestone, and it worked equally well. Most of the products worked equally well. The only reason we kind of are leaning toward doing something in the spring to give yourself a little more time for the herbicide to dissipate in the soil and get better establishment. You know, that was our original paradigm. But we've done it so many times either way, we don't really seem to see a big advantage. Because you are getting those extra months during the spring. And what I'm saying is you don't want to plant in the fall at a time when the grass might come up in the fall. You want to plant what most people would call a dormant season planting. So you want to plant in December where soil temperatures are cold enough, the grass isn't going to germinate until the next spring. So you actually have quite a bit more time than you think for dissipation of the herbicide and other things to happen. So we've seen excellent results both ways. Okay.
Do you know how long Russian napweed can be alive?
It's actually fairly short-lived in the soil. So the soil life is probably between 5 and 10 years at the most. So one thing we've often thought about is, after a while, if you get good grass establishment, can you eventually just deplete all the seeds in the soil seed bank? I don't know. I don't have any data on how viable the seed is. A lot of these plants vary tremendously in how much of the seed they produce is actually viable. In some cases, it can be as low as 5 or 10%. So even though there might be 12,000 seeds on or 1,200 seeds on the plant, only 5 or 10% of those are really viable. So that's another number I don't have off the top of my head is how much seed is really viable. But I tell you what, if you get a good in 2009, it was pretty obvious that there was plenty of viable seed in the seed bank at our Russian napweed sites because we just had a carpet of seed. But that was the first time Jim Sebastian was helping me with that project. And that was the first time Jim, I think he said the first time in 10 years he had seen a significant population of seedling Russian napweed. But for us along the Front Range, that was probably the best year we've had in 15 years for spring. Okay. Anything else? Yes?
You were mentioning that in your dry areas that Oregon was doing a lot better than Milestone. And in Fremont and Custer counties last year, we had some really, really dry sites, dry year. And we noticed that Milestone was behaving a lot differently on Russian napweed. And there were places where we had applied Milestone and it looked like it had not done anything. We actually got a call and I was like, that's weird, I treated that. And but when we actually, and we went ahead and retreated it, but when we looked at it, it never, it looked green, it looked healthy, big old standstill that hadn't ground or looked alive, but it never flowered. And so it never really did anything, and I guess I was just curious if you had seen that, and if you think it's going to come back with benefits next year, or that.
Actually, I think that's a good question. What I think is going to happen is, being as dry as it has been, we're going to get a little longer residual. So like the site at Ordway, I'm anticipating that this year we're not going to have hardly any rosettes survive because there'll be enough herbicide there to take out those rosettes. So I haven't seen this thing of effective flowering before, but I think what we're going to see is essentially an extra year of control because the herbicide, there's so little moisture that the herbicide is just not dissipating because the soil microbes aren't active enough. So we'll probably get another year of residual soil activity, and we'll see a lot less rosettes coming up that next spring. So I'm hoping that at the Ordway site anyway, we're going to see weed control extend for maybe an extra 12 months. Because normally, under normal conditions, even without a competitive grass there to keep the napweed in check, we normally see about 24 months of control. But that's assuming we've got good moisture for activity. And it doesn't really matter. That's the other neat thing about Milestone and a lot of these herbicides. You don't really need to have green material there to treat. You've got just a tremendous window of application from, like you can treat in the fall from September until you get snow in December, or you can come back in the spring and treat rosettes or bolted plants. So you have a very broad window of application. Okay? Thanks, everybody.